All right, I've got another video for you today, and today's topic is the deadlift. So we're going to be going over some of the most common errors that I see in people's deadlift setups and how we can improve your deadlift technique to result in a stronger pull. So before we get started, let's define what we actually mean by good deadlift technique. So obviously there is no kind of one universal technique that is going to suit everybody. Your technique is going to look very different depending on your individual anthropometry. So things like limb lengths, muscle insertions, your preferences, your goals, injury history, things like that. So there's no one technique that will suit everyone, but we do have some kind of overarching principles that we can use to kind of guide us. So rule number one, or kind of principle number one that we need to follow when trying to deadlift heavy weights, is that the bar needs to leave the floor over the middle of your foot. The reason is pretty simple. One, it's the strongest position to lift from because you will not be able to lift a heavy weight unless you're in balance. And two, if you look at a completed deadlift of someone holding the bar at the top of the rep, you will see the bar is positioned over the middle of the foot. So if the bar finishes over the middle of the foot, for efficiency purposes, it needs to start over the middle of the foot, because the most efficient way to get from point A to point B is a straight line, of course. So bar needs to move over the middle of the foot. This will happen naturally anyway for any heavy deadlift ever done. Like go look at your favorite deadlifter, pull a 1 rep max. The bar always leaves the floor over the middle of the foot. It doesn't matter how they set up. If they set up with their hips low, their hips high, the bar away from them, the bar close, the bar will always click into place over the middle of the foot before it leaves the floor. A good example of this is Eddie Hall's 500 kilo pull. So if you go watch, you'll notice he rolls the bar towards him. He actually squats down quite low with his hips a little bit too low. Then when he pulls, the bar comes a little bit closer to his shins, clicks into place over the middle of the foot, then the plates leave the floor and he completes the lift. So principle number one, the bar needs to be positioned over the middle of the foot. Then this kind of takes care of the rest of the setup automatically. So what will follow if the bar is over the middle of the foot? The bar will be positioned directly below the shoulder blades with the shoulders slightly in front of the bar. And that will produce an efficient setup for you regardless of your limb lengths, muscle insertions, preferences, those kind of things. So the first thing we just need to nail down is getting the bar over the middle of the foot. Everything else will usually take care of itself as long as the bar is positioned over the shoulder blades with the shoulders slightly in front of the bar. And we'll walk through that as we go through some of the errors and how we can kind of get to that technique. So the first mistake I see, and this is by far the most common one, is people squatting down too low. So their hips are too low at the start of the pull. Kind of a telltale sign that someone is doing this is their hips will shoot up first when they deadlift. So you'll see this kind of happens, the hips shoot up, then they complete the lift. And that kind of immediately tells me that their hips were too low at the start of the pull. I think people tend to do it because one, just there are some coaches out there teaching to get the hips down low, to squat down to the bar, to use the legs, to protect the back, that kind of thing. And I think people just do it to kind of try and gain a bit of leverage, right? It feels like you're getting your legs into the lift a little bit more. It does feel like your back is just in a safer position with less tension on it, I guess. You can even see great pullers like Eddie Hall. They drop their hips really, really low, and then his hips will shoot up to the correct position. Now, he's Eddie Hall, right? He's lifting 500 kilos, so he can get away with it. Us average lifters, we're not Eddie Hall. We want to control things as much as we can. We want as little moving parts as possible when we're lifting a 1 rep max because we want things predictable. You don't want joints moving around and altering your balance when you're trying to pull a 1 rep max off the floor, right? You want to start in a good position to finish in a good position. So let's get that start position down properly. So if you're dropping your hips down too low, which you can tell because like I said, your hips will shoot up first, or you can also notice your knees will be far forwards of your elbows. So you'll see from the side view, your knees will be poking forwards of the elbows quite significantly. So how do we fix it? So first things first, we need to get the bar positioned over the middle of the foot. So this all begins at your setup. So when you get set up for the lift, you must position the bar over the middle of your foot. So that will place the bar about an inch away from your shins. It might be a little bit closer than you're used to deadlifting, but you'll eventually get used to it as your setup kind of changes and adapts. So approach the bar, get set up with the bar over the middle of the foot, about an inch away from the shins. Then it's very important that you don't move the bar from this position, because we've just positioned it over the middle of the foot in the correct position. So if you move the bar from this point, you're kind of ruining that setup you've just created. So bar over the middle of the foot. Then I like to teach people to bend the knees just until the shins are touching the bar. Once the shins are touching the bar, stop, and then your hips are set at the correct height. So I learned this from actually Starting Strength and Alan Thrall. So I'll link a video somewhere where you can go check out Alan Thrall's deadlift setup, and you can see him go through that in depth. But yeah, essentially just bend the knees to lower the hips until the shins are touching the bar. Stop, because your hips will be at the correct height. Then you can set your back into position, and then you can complete the lift by dragging the bar up your shins. Yeah, so that's basically it. You just need to position the bar over the middle of your foot, and then only lower your hips until your shins touch the bar. Then they'll be in the correct position. A cue that I like to use with my clients is I tell them to get the knees lined up with the inside pits of their elbows. So you can see this holds true for most lifters, definitely holds true for me anyway. The knees will kind of sit flush with the inside pits of the elbows if the hips are at the correct height. And I found that cue to work very, very well for probably 90% or more of my lifters. So give that one a try. So yeah, error number one, hips too low. We fix it by positioning the bar over the middle of the foot, only lowering the hips until the shins are touching the bar, no further, and lining the knees up with the inside pits of the elbows. So error number two, and I see this one quite often as well, particularly at powerlifting competitions where people are lifting 1 rep maxes. And this one is leaning back too early at lockout. So what you will often see happen is the lifter gets the bar to the knees or just above the knees, and then immediately they start rushing and leaning back backwards away from the barbell. And I think they do this because they're trying to kind of lever the bar up their legs and gain a bit of an advantage. Because it feels natural, right? It feels like if you lean back, you're going to get yourself to lockout. But what actually ends up happening is the knees shove forward, and then you're stuck in this position where you're behind the bar, knees are shoved forward, and you end up having to kind of ramp and hitch the bar up your thighs. And usually the person doesn't end up locking out the weight. So instead of doing that, I want you to keep your shoulders in front of the bar for a little bit longer than you would like to, and think about flexing your quads hard when the bar approaches the knees as well. So a good cue that you can use is to break the deadlift down into kind of 2 movements. So I'll sometimes tell clients to leg press the bar off the floor for the initial half of the lift, and then to think about doing like an RDL or a hip thrust at the top. So you end up with this movement of kind of, so leg pressing for about 50%, and then you're doing an RDL or a hip thrust to lock it out, rather than what usually happens with this mistake is where the person will do the hip thrust part of the movement or the RDL part of the movement far too soon when they are leaning back, and they never really get to use their quads in the lift. So yeah, leg press off the floor, then into a hip thrust or an RDL. And those 2 main cues I would use is to keep the shoulders in front of the bar for longer, so think about that, and standing up tall using the quads, so flex the quads hard. Some combination of those cues usually works for most of my lifters. I would say the one I've had the most success with is simply just keeping the shoulders in front of the bar for longer. If you have someone that really struggles with it, I've also had some clients jump on a leg press as a warm-up for the deadlift, or in between deadlift sets, just some light leg pressing to kind of pattern that movement and cue it not happening. But yeah, keep the shoulders in front of the bar. Think about leg pressing the bar off the floor, and strong quads just standing up tall as opposed to leaning back. So think about at the top when you're locking out, just straight up with strong quads rather than leaning back, because your knees will shove forward. Error number 3, and this is kind of the final main error that I see. This one isn't quite as common, and I don't think it's quite as detrimental to the lift, but it definitely does have an impact. And And I've had a few times where I've actually coached a lifter and we've adjusted this and immediately performance has improved and their positioning has improved quite significantly, especially the lockout. And this one is positioning the head too far down with too much upper back flexion. So I noticed that a lot of lifters when they deadlift are kind of looking down directly at the floor or just out in front of them. And if you notice, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but if you just look, the eyes and the head position, the upper back position kind of follow the eye and the head position. So if I look up, my upper back naturally extends a little bit. If I look down, my upper back naturally rounds or flexes a little bit. So if I have a lifter who struggles with kind of upper back flexion when they deadlift, and they're getting to lockout and they're really struggling to lock out because their upper back is so flexed and they can't get it uncoiled to kind of finish the lift, what I'll have them do is just simply lift the head a little bit. So as opposed to looking down directly at the floor, I'll just tell them lift the chin a little bit, look out maybe 6 to 10 feet in front of them, and this will result in a little bit more upper back extension, making lockout a little bit easier. So this one is very simple to fix, and I find it actually makes one of the biggest improvements in people's deadlifts, especially the lockout. And if I show you a little clip of me deadlifting on screen, you'll see that I actually take the slack out of the bar, I set my position, I squeeze my chest up, and when I do that, I actually lift the head a little bit. And yeah, I'm probably looking out about 10 feet in front of me. So for you powerlifters out there, a good example would be to look at the judge in front of you when you deadlift, so kind of making eye contact with them. That's kind of the area that I'll be looking at. And yeah, it just sets the upper back in a little bit more extension and makes lockout a little bit smoother. So to end the video, I'm going to run through kind of 2 or 3 just really small errors that I see in people's deadlift as well. And we'll just kind of quick fire some solutions for them. So error number 1 is not taking any slack out of the bar. So just kind of yanking on the bar, and it's not really a smooth pull. You're just kind of yanking on that bar and getting thrown out of position. So it's a problem because, like I said, you get thrown out of position. It's unpredictable. You don't create any tension prior to the pull. There's a lot of moving parts, and again, we want predictability if we want you to be strong at a 1 rep max. So instead of yanking on the bar, gradually pull up on the bar whilst pushing down into the floor. So think of 2 movements happening, right? So you're exerting force upwards on the bar as well as downwards. So pushing your feet down into the floor as well as slowly pulling up on the bar, okay? So that's going to create tension in both directions. That will take what they call the slack out of the bar. You can also think of cues like long arms. I like using that one. Long arms in combination with leg pressing the floor down. That will allow you to take some slack out of the bar. You can also, if you actually go and test this for yourself, get a bar, put a plate on either side, and just pull up gradually on the bar, like pull up a little bit on the bar, and you'll hear it click against the sleeve of the plates. And what you can do when you deadlift is you can actually find that click by pulling up on the bar. Once you found it, hold that position and then push your feet into the bar to complete the lift. I got that from Instagram somewhere, but it's been pretty useful, so that's a good one to use. Another error I see, particularly in the conventional deadlift, is lifters taking an excessively wide stance compared to their structure. And I think they're probably trying to replicate people like Eddie Hall or Brian Shaw, like strongmen. But you got to realize these strongmen are huge. Like their hips are very, very wide, probably twice as wide as mine or yours. So typically when setting stance width, I would set your feet at hip width apart. So you want the hips kind of stacked over the knees, over the ankles. So looking for straight lines and alignment in the joints. Or a similar stance, and I know this one's kind of old school, but a similar stance to how you would take if you were going to try and jump as high as possible, like a vertical jump. Most likely you wouldn't go and do a jump with your feet really wide, would you? I know that argument kind of falls apart when we talk about sumo, but for conventional, I think it makes sense. Like we want the feet, we want the joints stacked in alignment, and that's where we're going to be able to produce the most force. There will be outliers to this. There'll be some people who just feel comfortable with a really close stance or a really wide stance, but those are exceptions. For most people, feet hip width apart. The final error, and this one isn't really an error, but just something that I think holds people back in the deadlift, is spending far too long in the bottom position setting up to the bar. So I used to do this before a few years ago. I would go down there, I would get set up, I would kind of do that hip pump thing where you like bring your hips up and down to the bar. I would do it like 10 times. It got really excessive. And I just found through experience that it really messed me up. Like, and I would fail 1 rep maxes because of it. Because I'd be down there, I'd psych myself out, and I would end up just kind of killing my positioning and my confidence going into the lift, and just wouldn't make the lift. So personally, I prefer in my deadlift to be very, very fast in the setup, as fast as possible. So I get down there and I literally set my grip and I pull the bar straight away. Most people won't prefer to pull that fast, but I think finding a happy medium between slow setup and fast is ideal. I don't think you want to spend a ton of time down there kind of overthinking and getting yourself worked up and nervous for the lift, because it might detract from performance. But similarly, some of you might not want to pull like me and get thrown out of position. So find a balance between the two, I would say. I think one argument you could make is that with my kind of style of setup, this more dynamic, faster start, you might get some kind of stretch reflex in the muscle, just because of the movement being so fast. There might be a tiny bit of elastic energy stored in the muscle, or maybe I'm just talking out of my ass, but I feel like there might be a small component of that versus starting in a very like static, slow position. I don't know, just being down there really slow, I feel like I'm having to just purely brute force the bar off the floor, as opposed to kind of getting down there fast and explosively lifting it. But mess around with both and see what works for you. But yeah, anyway, that is the main errors that I typically see in the deadlift. I hope you found this video informative. I hope you took some kind of tips and tricks to improve your own deadlift. If you hit any deadlift PRs as a result of this video, make sure to let me know in the comments down below, or you can tag me on Instagram at Ben Evidence Based Strength. I'm very open to topics and suggestions for future videos as well, so go ahead and comment those down below. Purpose of these videos is just to kind of educate and inform, and just kind of share things with you that have worked for myself. I'm still in the process of learning to get stronger, and the things that I've kind of implemented with my athletes to help them get stronger. We can all share ideas and all get stronger together. So if you've got any questions, post them up down below. Like I said, check out Instagram, subscribe to the channel for future videos, and I will catch you guys in the next one.